It is my great honor to introduce our next panel, the Fisheries Governance in Dynamic Systems. Our panelists will be exploring the political economy and ecosystem-based approaches to international fisheries governance. Our first panelist is D.G. Webster, an assistant professor at Dartmouth University, where she focuses on global-scale social ecological systems. She will be talking about moving beyond the tragedy in global fisheries. Our next panelist, Elizabeth Havice, is an assistant professor of international development and globalization in the geography department at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. She will discuss how industry dynamics matter to fisheries management and draw upon lessons from industrial tuna fisheries. Eric Gilman is associate professor at Hawaii Pacific University, Fisheries Advisor at the Sustainable Fisheries Partnership, and Corporate Environmental Responsibility Director for Luen Tai Fishing Venture. His talk will focus on progress by regional fisheries management organizations in transition to ecosystem-based fisheries management. Our final panelist, Martine Hall, is Principal Scientist and Head of Bycatch Programs of the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission. He will discuss institutions for international fisheries management. Okay, DG, we're ready for you. Come on up.
Hi. Well, that's quite an act to have to follow, but it's very appropriate since I'm talking about beyond tragedy in global fisheries. And we just had a good overview of the management of global fisheries, or fisheries globally. I want to preface this by saying this is based on a book that I'm currently writing that delves very deeply into the history of the evolution of fisheries around the world and fisheries governance and fisheries economics. So we're going to be very lucky if I stay within my 15 minutes. So we all know that the tragedy of the commons is at the heart of the problems that we have with fisheries globally, right? The fact that fishermen can't leave the fish in the ocean because somebody else might come along and take them. But if you look at the literature, we see in fact that there are many other factors that are involved in creating these problems for fisheries. We have endogenous fishery responses, we have exogenous economic drivers, we have competing political forces. Most of my talk is going to go into these in very slight detail, actually. But what I want to point out first is that, in fact, if we look at the long history of the evolution of global fisheries, what we see is that the interactions between these forces actually make the tragedy of the commons problem much, much worse than it would be ceteris paribus. And therefore, if we want to deal with these problems, the problem of the tragedy of the commons of global fisheries, we also need to deal with these outside forces. So for endogenous fishery responses, we have economic responses, we have political responses. Entrepreneurship is the primary economic response. Collective action and lobbying are two political responses. Since the second two, I think, are fairly well understood and well researched, I'm only going to talk a little bit today about entrepreneurship. Right? And I don't just mean the struggle to stay competitive in a dying fishery. Right? I don't just mean the struggle against the tragedy of commons. I mean the entrepreneurial spirit exhibited by certain fishermen, certainly not all fishermen, certain fishermen, that allow them to explore, seeking out new stocks, to engineer better methods of catching fish. Right? Without these things, they would not be able to catch the amount of fish that they catch today. And the marketing side of things. Because even if they could catch this much fish, it would not be economically viable if processors hadn't developed new methods of processing and if marketers hadn't convinced consumers to buy it. These things are incredibly important, and they are not necessarily part of the tragedy of the commons. We see that entrepreneurship has occurred in fisheries throughout history, including fisheries where property rights are established. Right? You can go back to ancient Sumeria, where fisheries guilds had rights to fish in certain areas. And we still see A, overexploitation, and we still see B, entrepreneurship. Oh, damn it. This is going to be tough, folks. It's going to be tough. So, throughout history, in fact, we see this entrepreneurship on the part of, again, certain fishermen. And it is one of the main things that allows our production to be what it is today. The other side of this is that much of this entrepreneurship occurs in processing and marketing. Right? And we forget that side. I think the question earlier about, well, what about the demand side? That's like, they stole my thunder right there. But that's the thing. If the processors had not figured out how to can fish, how to freeze fish, you would not be able to bring it to inland markets. You would not be able to have the level of exploitation that we have today. Right? This is an iron chink, just for, actually this is a bank of iron chinks. So these are the machines that were developed to clean and process the fish. It took it from a labor-intensive process to a completely mechanized process, completely changed the structure of the industry, made it cost-effective, transformed canned fish, particularly salmon, oysters, from a good that was actually a luxury good into the food for the masses. These kinds of innovations. So these endogenous responses are important, but we don't pay too much attention to them. Exogenous drivers, population pressure, economic growth. Again, supply increases, demand doesn't, prices drive out effort. Right. History of fishing, population growth, economic growth, growth in demand for fish products. Growth and demand for fish, as well as other kinds of resources. Right. I'm going to talk a little bit more about globalization, because this was key. All of those innovations that I just told you about would not be feasible if not for the availability of capital associated with globalization. Right. You had to have the money to invest. If you didn't have the money to invest, you wouldn't be able to build bigger boats and mechanize them and all of that fun stuff. Industrialization was key as well. Many of the changes in fisheries technologies were taken from non-fisheries areas, most important ones. And international trade. Again, it goes to cost, right, the supply side, but also to demand. Without international trade, that demand would not have increased as much as it did. Supply would have been dampened. At the same time, fishermen actually fairly early learned that if they could move their operations to places where their costs were cheaper, they could save money, they could continue producing in spite of the fact that it was harder and harder to find fish. Right? So these are important exogenous drivers that we need to pay attention to. Here's an example. So the top left there is a 135 gross registered tonnage Dutch herring vessel from the 1600s. That was a big, big boat at the time. In fact, that was a big boat until the 1800s. In the 1800s, because of the Industrial Revolution, because of the invention of steam power, because of the mechanization, because of eventually the introduction of petroleum, we got to this point. Right? More than 7 times larger in terms of size, and perhaps 1,000 times larger in terms of efficiency. These are not just changes caused by the tragedy of the commons. They are also catalyzed by the larger context of growth and technological change. Political forces, my third wheel, as you might say. If we look at the history of fisheries management, I hate to say it, but conservation was not the top of anybody's agenda until 30 years ago. Anybody's agenda. Conflict resolution, again, back to our Sumerians. Right? There were 2 things that the regulations were about. Making sure that the priests in the temples who were in charge of at the time got their cut,
and solving conflicts between fishermen over resources. You can follow, aside from the Romans were the ones who were like, oh, you know, whoever wants to can take it. Aside from the Romans, just about everybody else that I could find was about establishing rights of access, establishing who should get to benefit, right? And then reducing conflict. Primary drivers of fisheries management throughout time. Eventually, conservation became an issue. Right? But even then, a lot of it was conservation for development. So in World War II, food became a major issue in the United States and elsewhere because we hadn't been productive for a while. We destroyed a whole bunch of sources of food. We needed that resource. A guy named Wilbert Chapman happened to work for the State Department right after the war. He said, hey, these guys over in biology have this cool idea called maximum sustainable yield. And if we use this maximum sustainable yield, we can actually make sure to maximize the jobs that we have in our fishing industry and the food that we eat from our fishing industry. He worked for the State Department. And he made sure that it was the State Department's objective in fisheries to ensure that maximum sustainable yield was applied throughout the world. Right? According to a woman named Finley, a historian, not just a woman, but a historian, right? She's documented with internal State Department documents that the US also used this abroad as a reason to continue to be able to fish in other countries' quote-unquote waters. Of course, at the time, we didn't have EEZs, but certainly countries in South America and elsewhere were trying to claim these 200-mile zones. And we were using, again, that MSY, thank you, to essentially drive allocation, drive economic development. Even in the 70s, right, the FAO was saying, the FAO, the UN, Bretton Woods, they were all saying fisheries are a route to development. It wasn't until the 80s and the 90s that we finally saw that that's not necessarily so, that we can overdo it. Right? So what's the upshot of all this? These three additional magnifying factors. Well, for one thing, a lot of them were reaching the limits. Right? Exploration. There's not a lot of places in the world's oceans that aren't fished. We all know that here. I don't have to tell you. Engineering. There haven't been a lot of big advances in the engineering of fleets recently, but I have talked to fisher boat owners who are looking into renewable energy resources because of the costs of fuel. And if they do that, they will be halving their costs of production if they can go into renewables, which means that they will be able to increase production much more, even with smaller stock sizes. Does this mean that we should ask them not to do renewables? It's not for me. Marketing, also, we have seen as ecosystems shift due to fishing pressure, it does not mean that the industry dies. It just means the industry changes. So we have our friendly lobster, we have our friendly cod, neither of which would ever be seen anywhere near each other because the one eats the other. Well, the cod would like to be near the lobster, but the lobsters run away from the cod. Right. Codfish goes away on the Grand Banks in the North Atlantic. Lobster goes from a cheap source of protein. It's marketed, instead of being canned lobster, they figure out ways to ship it very quickly, and it becomes this valuable, high-priced commodity. The fishery, not every fisherman, not every fishing company, but the fishing industry prevails. And we've seen this in a lot of different places. Right? So it's something to think about. Of course, this is economic resilience. Right? The fishermen are very resilient economically. But it's not sustainability. It's not sustainability. In fact, it's not that great for a large number of fishermen. What's happening is that certain fishermen, the entrepreneurs, are always pushing that edge. They're the ones who are making lots of money, and then lots of other fishermen are left behind. They're the ones in the stagnant fisheries. They're the ones who have to drive my taxis when I'm driving around Boston, right, because they can't make a living. Right? So what do we do? Well, this is in addition to everything else you guys have been talking about. I'm not saying that we need to stop with regular management approaches. What I am saying, though, is that we need to think about the demand side of things. Because as long as we have this increasing price signal, as long as demand continues to increase, price will continue to increase. And in fact, as supply declines, price will increase further. And what do we know about the most high-priced species in the oceans? They're almost gone, right? If we cannot get a handle on this demand side of things, fishermen will continue to A, have a lot of incentives to target the fish, and B, have incentives to cheat. Right? So your management is going to keep getting more and more expensive if we can't get a handle on the demand side of things. Because they're going to keep having reasons, more and more reasons, to figure out ways around it. Ultimately, though, and I know this is not something that we can accomplish, but it is perhaps something that might happen. If we want to save the fisheries in the world, it requires a socioeconomic transformation. Fisheries are deeply tied into the global economy. This is an industry. This is not just the tragedy of the commons. And so the problems that we are dealing with here in terms of global fisheries are problems that they deal with in every other environmental fora, because they are associated with the same thing. Impact equals population times affluence times technology. So, in the end, my take-home point, save the fish, save the world. And I should add, hopefully save the fishermen, right? Because they're important too. Thank you. To think about right there.
So you mentioned at the very beginning of your talk about innovation and entrepreneurship and how that's been really important for expanding production. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the role of entrepreneurship and innovation and trying to tap that energy for sustainability. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think actually Eric is going to talk about ways that a lot of fishermen have been able to develop new technologies and new processes to, in fact, for instance, avoid bycatch, improve ecosystem-based management. Of course, there's also aquaculture, which is a double-edged sword, but goes back much longer than you think. Again, I love the Sumerian case, but they actually did aquaculture when they ran out of fish. So if we could find a way to do aquaculture without those additional problems that are like catching too many wild fish to feed the farm fish, et cetera, then that would be a really big boon. Of course, there is this problem of farming the oceans, right? Do we want them to look like Idaho? But
Eddie Game, the Nature Conservancy. It's a very related question. I saw a wonderful piece of work at one stage showing that there's only a handful of countries who recommend dietary intake of fish at a certain amount. Mm-hmm. Europe, a number of European countries, the US, Australia, etc. And if we were to apply that to even half the rest of the countries in the world, we just don't there's just not enough wild capture fish for countries to meet what we in Australia and you in the US consider the basic amount of fish that we should be eating. So I guess your point about aquaculture is well taken. If that, but is there is there any effort or is there any role for a sort of national revision of what we think is an appropriate amount of fish to be eating?
Mm-hmm. I'm a big fan of actually letting politics happen. So certainly that could be the case, but what you still need is the political will to go there. And you also need the legitimacy, right? So how many people remember the food triangle? Right, the food pyramid, sorry, food pyramid. What is it now? What is it now? It's the food plate, So the government's been telling us a lot about what we should eat for a long time, and we don't listen to them. So I really do think it's about people, I think, and it has been changing. The more crises we have, the more I go to parties and people are like asking me about ocean acidification and bluefin tuna and all of these different things. So hypothetically, those kinds of things may actually start people thinking in different directions. But I'm really talking about a deep systemic sociological change as opposed to a regulated, although the one can certainly lead to the other, or help. Yeah.
Alistair Hobday, DG. I earn the same amount every year, no matter how much harder I work or how many hours I do. Fishermen don't have salaries that are capped, right? The harder they work, the more they make. Do you think a process of basically a salary scale for fishers would bring back some of that? I don't know, it would kind of restrict entrepreneurship, but it would set realistic expectations about what they can earn in that living. Maybe a way of controlling some of the negatives that happen from the idea that I can earn as much money as I can, if I catch as much as I can.
Wow, yeah, that's an interesting thought. I know that, for instance, in the 1800s, when they started having steam-powered fishing vessels, they actually did use a salaried system for a little while. And what happened was the boat owners essentially rejected it, as the boat owners would today, because they need that incentive to ensure that that the fishermen are actually trying to maximize the catch. So you would have to, I mean, hypothetically, that could work, but you would have to work Elizabeth's going to talk about this in a minute. You'd have to work with the industry very closely on that.
Okay, that's going to be our last question. You can come back to the panel. So thank you, Dee.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, and thanks for having me here and including me in the discussion. This has been super interesting, and DG, that was a great way for me to launch off on what I'm going to be talking about, which is a little bit more sector-specific. But every 2 years, the tuna industry meets together in Bangkok, and it's nice to be in a room where other people might share my enthusiasm at that kind of a meeting taking place. But at this time last year, I was at that meeting, and I was really struck when Glenn Hurry, the executive director of the Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, the Tuna RFMO in the Western Pacific, in offering his overview of trends in the tuna sector that he oversees, he asserted that fisheries managers need to start to recognize that it's not countries that fish, it's companies. And this was a really big moment for me in my work, because in all this time I've been spending studying the tuna industry, there's so much discussion about what the Japanese are doing, what the US are doing, what the Koreans are doing. And so to see the executive director of a fisheries management organization emphasize that we need to start thinking about companies and firms was really important. So I know that fisheries managers have their hands full with the complexities of population dynamics, interstate politics that determine which scientific advice is taken up, all of the things we talked about yesterday. But as a result, fisheries management bodies and managers are rarely recognizing the economic complexity of interests that are driving environmental change in fisheries. So we heard yesterday from Natalie and from Rashid a little bit about fisheries economics and institutional social science. These fields are doing a huge amount of work in helping us to understand fisheries resource use patterns. But the wider drivers of industrial fishing and industrial fishing practices are often absent from these analyses. So the main message that I want to make today, that I want to drive home, is that industry dynamics matter a lot for fisheries management. They matter a lot for dynamic approaches to ocean conservation or static approaches, whichever approach we end up taking in the end. But to convince you of this point, I'm going to try to illustrate this matter by drawing on my work in industrial tuna sector. I'm going to be focusing on the canned tuna industry, and this is something of an interesting or unique case study because of how large scale it is and how industrialized it is. But I do think that many of the broad pressures that I'm going to be talking about are relevant across sectors. Even small scale fisheries that are trying to access international markets with their products are facing the same dynamics that I'll talk about in the canned tuna sector. So let's see. Oh, here's my clicker. So here's my main point. Firm dynamics shape resource use patterns. So we need to think about what these firm dynamics are. The first dynamic is corporate concentration. So what we're seeing in the tuna sector is that branded firms, Starkist, Chicken of the Sea, Bumblebee, and large supermarkets, Walmart, Tesco's, their activities, they're becoming increasingly consolidated industries and sectors, and that this has a big impact on resource use patterns in global tuna fisheries. I'll give examples of each of these things as we go along. The second key point is that tuna fishing companies and processing firms are also undertaking very active activities that influence how management happens and how resources are being used. So these firms, fishing firms and processing firms, cooperate with states. The states where they operate and are registered, and their distant water fishing areas where they undertake activities, fishing activities or processing activities. And they work with states to establish beneficial fisheries management regimes, beneficial trade regimes, and beneficial resource access regimes. And I'll go over examples of each of those as well. So overall, my argument is that understanding these relationships in the context of multidisciplinary research can contribute to explaining competitive conditions in the sector and the socio-ecological outcomes in tuna fisheries that we're interested in. So these policy outcomes can be a wide range of things. We've been hearing discussions about these: species-specific concerns, ecosystem-based management, socio-ecological or socioeconomic outcomes, the interests of indigenous communities and fishing sectors. So these are the points I'm going to go through now, drawing on the tuna industry. So I'll start with corporate concentration in the tuna chain. Then I'll move to fisheries access agreements, just one example there, and one example of how the global trade regime in the tuna chain operates, and then I'll give some concluding thoughts. So let's start with the tuna commodity chain. This is just a very simplified version of the tuna commodity chain. It's a great sector to do commodity chain analysis because it's global and dynamic, but it's still a relatively short commodity chain, so it's pretty easy to get a handle on. So we start on your left with fishing. We have purse seine fishing and longline fishing. Those vessels will either sell their product directly to processing firms. Sometimes they offload right at processing firms. Other times they'll sell to a trading company, and the trading company will deliver the fish to the processing firms. Then processing happens in an array of different formats, and then the processing firms send that off to retailers, either using an importing company or in direct relationships. So really basic. The notable point here is that the arrows that I've highlighted on this graph, they demonstrate the flow of product, but they don't demonstrate the power dynamics between the various corporate actors. So if we talk about which firms are more powerful in determining how these supply relationships operate, the arrows can go in the opposite direction. So how does that work? What we're seeing is a huge amount of corporate concentration in both the European Union market and the US retail markets. So many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this phenomenon, the Walmart effect. And canned tuna is a really important product for understanding this. So what does this look like? Grocery retail is now highly concentrated, and retailers have buying power, so this gives them power over the entire tuna production chain. So if we just look at these top two rows here, so in the US, the data is slightly different. So in the US, it's not the top 5 supermarkets percentage share of total grocery sales. In the US, this data is for the top 10 firms. But the top 10 retail chains control 80% of grocery sales. 10 firms control 80% of sales. So this is really big and important information. Across Europe, the rest of the data is for the top 5 supermarket brands, but we're seeing these same levels of concentration, upwards of 5 firms controlling half to 80 or even 90% of the entire retail market. So that gives them a huge amount of buying control. The second two categories are important because I'm distinguishing between private label and branded label tuna products. So we know that Walmart or Costco, they have their own brands. The Kirkland brand, right? I think it's Costco, right? Kirkland is that firm's own brand, as opposed to private brands, Starkist, Bumblebee, Chicken of the Sea. So in the United States, private label is less important in canned tuna than it is in Europe. So here in the US, 60% of canned tuna that's sold is sold under private labels, Bumblebee, Starkist. But in Europe, we're seeing that 95% in Germany of all canned tuna sales are done under supermarkets' own labels. So what that means is the supermarket goes down to the processors and says, I have these specifications, I want this kind of tuna in this size of can, I want it in oil, I want it in brine or water, whatever the case may be. And then they also say, I want it at this price. And I need it at this price. I'm selling 95% of all tuna in the country, in the Netherlands. So you're going to comply with my demands. But private, also the brands Starkist and those are still increasingly important. But these are different battles for control over how the market works. So the main point is grocery retail is highly concentrated, and this exerts power across the chain. Concentration and control is also deepening in canned tuna brands. So now what we're seeing is that there are 6 firms, 6 lead branded firms in the United States and the European Union markets. So we're seeing huge amounts of consolidation also in the center of the tuna commodity chain. So these are our familiar brands in North America: Bumblebee, Chicken of the Sea, Starkist, Prince's, John West, Calvo in Europe. And now let's look at who owns those brands. Just 6 firms. We're seeing an increased growth in Lion Capital is a capital investing firm that owns the Bumblebee brands. Thai Union, a Thai firm, owns Chicken of the Sea, John West, all of these major brands. Dongwon is a Korean firm that owns Starkist. In 2012, Dongwon was also making a bid to purchase 50% of Calvo. And in the end, there was a big twist, and the Bolton Group in Europe instead purchased 40%. So we're seeing even more concentration, even though we have, thanks, 5 minutes, even though we only have 6 firms that are operating at this point. So why does this matter? This matters because if you're 6 firms and this is your business model, 2 cans for $1, you have to be extremely concentrated in order to make money. So the canned tuna sector operates on wafer thin margins. So they have to be a very high volume business. So this is what's driving concentration. And so this matters for managers, right? What we're seeing is this very intense conflict between how fishing and processing happens and what the objectives of resource managers are. If resource managers are trying to cut back how much fishing takes place, but if you're a firm and you only can make money by increasing volume in order to get more margin, more of your small margin, then we're seeing tensions emerging at the site of management. Okay, we also have concentration down here at the trading company level. In the Western and Central Pacific Ocean, there are 3 trading companies that move 80% of all of the fish that's caught in the Western and Central Pacific Ocean. 60% of all tuna comes from the Western and Central Pacific Ocean, and 3 firms control 80% of that. They get it from the vessels, and they send it off to the processing sites. So there's another huge bottleneck in how this industry operates. Okay, but what about boats? This is what we're talking about managing. We're talking about managing the vessels, but who are the boats? What does this even mean? The point I want to make is that fishing firms are highly differentiated. There are many, many different models for how vessels operate and how they try to make money. So this is a case from the European Union Distant Water Fleet. All of these things are snapshots. This is just from 2011 data. But the key point is that fishing firms take many different forms. So what we see on the one hand If we look there at Albacora Group, this is a processing firm that's vertically integrated into fishing. They have 16 total vessels, and they own them as a part of their integrated processing firm. But if we look at Atunza, for example, they're a specialized fishing firm. They have only 6 vessels, and they're not vertically integrated into processing. A key point here is that these dynamics of vertical integration versus disintegration change very rapidly, and historically over time have been different. So in the 1970s and 80s and into the 1990s, there was a huge glut of fish that was on the international market in tuna. And so what we saw was a disintegration between processing firms and fishing firms. Processing firms were just buying fish on spot, making spot market transactions all of the time. But what we're seeing now is that there's increasing sort of feeling that there's resource scarcity. So what we're seeing is more processing firms entering into these vertical relationships so that they can secure their supply in the long run. So these kinds of changes are happening very rapidly in order to try to secure supply and eliminate risk. So in the 80s and 1990s, processing firms didn't want to be involved in the boat business. It's very risky, it's costly, there's lots of volatility. But now, as resources are more scarce, we're seeing processing firms make those investments again. So it's highly dynamic. Okay, and so what else are we seeing in affecting this supply chain overall? The Marine Stewardship Council certification process. So this is a market-based incentive to try to promote sustainability, but again, this is having big effects on how supply chains operate. It's another pressure that firms are feeling. I'm not crying for them, but just to say that these are the dynamics that they're juggling as they go through making their business decisions. Greenpeace is pushing, WWF are putting pressure on retailers. The retailers are responding to that pressure by demanding down the supply chain that all of the other suppliers comply and undergo certification processes. In the middle of the chain, the tuna processing firms have been very resistant to undertaking Marine Stewardship Council certification. In the United States, they have a bitter history with this kind of certification, the tuna dolphin issue, the first eco-label that we ever experienced. And so for a long time, that industry has been pushing back and saying, we don't want to go through another labeling debacle. It confuses consumers. But just 2 weeks ago, Bumblebee announced that it's going to start to market its first MSC certified tuna products very shortly. So that was a really big shift. But then that also means that the vessels have to go through the process of earning the certification as well. So this is a big problem in the tuna sector. Again, high volumes, low margins, and the purse seine vessels, they can't make money fishing under the conditions required to earn the MSC label. So they are having to comply and adapt and make changes in order to get these sustainability certifications. Okay, I think I have, how much time? 1 minute? Okay, so I'll just give one example. We can talk about tuna fisheries access arrangements later. These are the arrangements where distant water fishing nations negotiate with foreign countries to try to gain access to their waters. But I'll give the example of the tuna trade regime instead. So the trading regime determines how much tariffs a country pays in order to access major markets. So what we're seeing is that the European Union and US trade arrangements have a huge impact on the geography of tuna processing. Where are the tuna processing plants built in order to access the major markets in the United States, Europe, and Japan? And in turn, this shapes and determines the sources of tuna supply. So I'll just give one interesting example. American Samoa, this map shows all of the tuna processing plants around the world. The dots are the size and what kind of processing that they do. But if we look at American Samoa, here, it was historically the home to 2 of the world's largest processing plants in a small island location. One of those has since closed, but the reason that those processing plants were built there is because they get duty-free access into the US market. That saves them between 12 and 32% tariff in comparison with Thai canneries that they're competing with. In addition, American Samoa has the benefit of, historically, it didn't have to follow US labor laws. So wages there were roughly $3 an hour instead of $7 an hour in the United States. So these kinds of trade relations are really important for the geography of production. And of course, American Samoa is close to the fishing grounds as well. All right, so to wrap up, this kind of commodity chain analysis or political economy analysis can contribute to dynamic approaches to ocean conservation. The key points here are that it can help us to understand the horizontal and vertical competitive relations, institutional conditions, and corporate drivers in industry. What I mean by horizontal relationships is how does StarKist compete with Bumblebee? For vertical relationships, what I mean is how does Walmart determine product specifications to Bumblebee? So we see all of those kinds of dynamics taking place. Another benefit of this is that it helps us to analyze boats as differentiated firms that have distinct corporate and production strategies. They're not abstract units of profit maximization. They are, and these different licensing structures, regulatory structures change the kinds of incentives that the boats operate under. It helps us to assess different firm responses to environmental change, price fluctuations, regulations, and all of this is really having an effect on the structure of the tuna industry. And finally, it can help us to identify strategic points in the chain for data collection and regulation, including the targeting of poor corporate players, and also their relationships with states. So there's a whirlwind tour of the tuna industry for you.
Maxwell, Stanford University. Thank you, that was fascinating. And I was just curious, and this is a little bit of a leading question given a conversation that you and I had yesterday.
Yeah.
But how are the boats actually responding to these kind of pressures, like in terms of MSC certification or the increasing decrease of the profit margin? How do they respond to that in order to continue to survive?
Yeah, this is a great question. What's happening in the tuna industry, a lot of this is related to how dynamic the sector is as a whole. So it's very difficult to even determine what maximum economic yield would mean in a fishery like this, or really in any fishery. All of the conditions are highly variable. So right now, the last about year and a half have been great smooth sailing for vessel owners. Skipjack prices are at a historic high. They're selling right now for about $2,400 a ton. They've been down as low as $800 a ton in the past. So this changes the whole sets of incentives for how vessel operators are thinking about management. And this links us back to these questions about are individual quotas what kinds of incentives are they going to create? So right now things are smooth sailing for vessel owners, but they're also fishing really hard to try to make up for times when prices are lower or when resource scarcity changes. But one of the things that we were talking about yesterday that I've been really amazed by is how fast capital can move from different, throughout the commodity chain. The example I gave yesterday was the tuna dolphin case. The US vessels left the United States when they couldn't comply with tuna dolphin regulations and either moved to the Western Pacific, where tuna and dolphin don't school together, or reflagged in Latin America. And what we're seeing now is that vessels are investing in flags that can help them to gain access to resources as regulations are changing, trying to tighten down. So things are moving fast.
Thank you.
Sure.
We have time for one more question.
Sorry, I went over my time.
Steve Berriger. I like the systematic way you've approached the economic side of it. Is somebody working on the political side in the same systematic way? Because it seems to me that these large firms have economic power,
Yeah.
but they also have sort of an insidious political power.
Yes. So I wanted to really pull out this segment of my work, and also on the first slide, this is work that I've done in collaboration with my colleague Liam Campling at University of London. And both of us have also been working on these connections with politics. So what we're seeing is one of the key points here is how are firms working with their home states and their host states in whatever activities they're undertaking, whether it's processing or fishing. And that's a huge part of the equation, and we see that really come to a head in regional fisheries management organizations, and also in this sector in particular in the fisheries access arrangements. That the US, Europe, and Japanese governments are very closely involved with negotiating the terms by which fishing firms are going to have access to foreign waters. And those become about questions about geopolitical relations. The United States is in the Pacific and has stayed there. They went there first as a response to Cold War politics. It's still our only diplomatic aid in the region, and we're there now because China is starting to move into that region. And Hillary Clinton was very involved in renegotiating some of these fishing licenses. So all of these it's not just the economic story. The politics get very complicated very quickly.
Thank you.
But I think just one point is that these questions about retail consolidation, Marine Stewardship Council certification, these are affecting even very small-scale fisheries that are trying to access international markets. So some of these geopolitical questions are very specific to the tuna sector and the international nature of the fish and the fishery. But even these market dynamics are relevant to all fisheries that are involved in international markets.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to discuss progress by regional fisheries management organizations in incorporating elements of ecosystem-based fisheries management and describe some opportunities to help continue that transition. I'll describe the aims and approaches for ecosystem-based fisheries management, approaches to mitigate fishing mortality of vulnerable populations, populations that are vulnerable to fisheries overexploitation because of their life history characteristics and their susceptibility to capture in marine fisheries. Methods for estimating and then accounting for cryptic, largely undetectable sources of fishing mortality and indirect effects of fishing operations. The performance of regional fisheries management organizations, governance of bycatch, which is one element of an ecosystem approach to fisheries. How a new fisheries metadata catalog that's part of a website called fisherieswiki.org has the capacity to contribute to improved international fisheries governance. And I'll conclude by describing some priorities to fill deficits by RFMOs in their governance of high seas fisheries and to catalyze a transition to ecosystem-based fisheries management. Put very simply, the aim of ecosystem-based fisheries management is to sustain both ecosystem structure and processes as well as ecosystem services. The four main ecological objectives are to manage fishing mortality of vulnerable, associated, and dependent species, to maintain viable populations, as well as to rebuild and recover units that are threatened with extirpation, to mitigate the degradation and loss of habitat from fishing operations, to minimize indirect effects such as adverse effects on food web structure and processes, and to stay within ecosystem level limit reference points to avoid irreparably harming the stocks of multiple species, as well as to sustainably produce maximum multi-species yields. There's a wide range of methods to mitigate unwanted fishing mortality. I'll provide examples of gear technology approaches to mitigate bycatch, which involve changes in fishing gear and fishing methods, and methods for using time area restrictions to avoid temporally and spatially predictable bycatch hotspots. One example of how time area restrictions can be used for bycatch mitigation is avoiding pelagic fishing at shallow features like seamounts and banks. As one example, in the Hawaii longline tuna fishery, we found that there were significantly higher sea turtle and big-eye thresher shark standardized catch rates at a shallow seamount compared to standardized catch rates at areas on the open ocean. As an example of a gear technology approach to mitigating unwanted bycatch, As one example, the best practice gear technology method to mitigate turtle bycatch and to minimize their ingestion of hooks in longline fisheries is to use a wider circle hook and fish bait instead of using a narrower J-shaped hook with squid bait, and to set your gear below about 100 meters, get the gear deeper to avoid where the sea turtles forage. As one example, when the Hawaii longline swordfish fishery was required to switch from using a narrow J-shaped hook and squid bait to using a wider circle hook and fish bait, there was a significant decline of about 89% in combined turtle species nominal catch rate. There was also a significant decline in the proportion of caught turtles that swallowed the hook deeply into their esophagus and deeper. But what about the effect of this change in hook and bait on other vulnerable groups? International guidance, such as FAO's International Plans of Action and binding bycatch measures by RFMOs, have largely been piecemeal. They focus on one species group without considering the effects of required measures across other vulnerable taxa. As one example, there's now a large body of evidence of how using wider circle hooks helps to reduce sea turtle catch rates and injury, and there's some preliminary evidence that using circle-shaped hooks also helps reduce seabird catch rates. However, studies have shown variable effects of hook design on elasmobranch sharks and their relatives. In many fisheries, studies document about a 10% increase in shark catch rates on circle hooks relative to their catch rate on tuna and J-shaped hooks. The figure in the bottom right here presents results from a recent study we conducted in Hawaii's longline tuna fishery. We found a small but significantly higher blue shark standardized catch rate on wider circle hooks relative to their catch on tuna hooks, a J-shaped hook. So this is just one example. The point is that there's benefit in holistically assessing the relative effects across taxa for a change in gear or change in methods. Some collateral effects of fishing operations result in cryptic or not readily detectable sources of mortality. For example, using this demersal trawl schematic, alive escapees as well as organisms that are released alive may be predated as they sink or swim back to their preferred habitat. Collateral mortalities can result from increased predation and competition for shelter by species that had used habitat that's been degraded by the fishing operation, and cumulative sublethal stressors from an organism that repeatedly has to avoid being captured can contribute eventually to its mortality. In addition to population level effects from fishery removals, fishing operations also have indirect effects, which range from altering the evolutionary characteristics of populations, such as by selecting for a subset of a population by length or age class or sex, to broader community level effects. And as one example, it's been hypothesized that drifting fads, fish aggregating devices, which are used primarily in purseine tuna fisheries, that they may cause community level effects. An artificially high density of these human-made floating objects may reduce optimal school sizes of pelagic species. It may transport the organisms to areas outside of their normal distributions, modifying their diet. And in some regions, it may trap organisms in areas of low productivity. It may also affect their behavior, such as their horizontal movements and their vertical habitat use and dial vertical migration cycles. As a second example of a collateral effect of fishing operations, large inputs of biomass from offal, spent bait, and dead catch can also change the foraging behavior, diet, competition between species, community composition, and in areas where discharges are concentrated and in areas of low current flow can cause localized anoxia. And as one example, pelagic fisheries can transfer biomass between pelagic to benthic ecosystems where their discharges may settle through the water column without being consumed and make it to the benthic habitat. Regional fisheries management organizations, or RFMOs, provide a formal mechanism for states to meet their international obligations to sustainably govern fisheries for shared living marine resources, both within their domestic waters and on the high seas. A large proportion of global marine fisheries are now managed by one or multiple RFMOs, and most areas of the high seas are now covered by at least one RFMO. In a study that we published with IUCN last year, we assessed RFMO's bycatch governance, which is one element of an ecosystem approach. The primary or left-hand y-axis shows their scores relative to current best practice, which was achieved by CAMLAR, the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic marine living resources. And the secondary right-hand y-axis shows their nominal percent score against optimal or possibly achieved best practice. The mean score was 25% with large dispersion in scores, which ranged between 1% to 58%. Collectively, the RFMOs have very large governance deficits, and individually there's been mixed progress. Some of the RFMOs have made tremendous achievements for some elements of an ecosystem approach for managing bycatch. Data collection protocols by RFMOs need improvement. Only about half of the minimum information needed to assess binding bycatch measures is currently collected through regional observers. Over 2/3 of fisheries that are managed by an RFMO lack any regional observer coverage. Ecological risk assessments have largely focused on the effects of removals on vulnerable species and direct effects on benthic vulnerable marine ecosystems. They've largely not evaluated broader community to ecosystem level indirect effects. Controls are in place for about 1/3 of vulnerable species bycatch problems. Many of these measures fall short of best practice in terms of where they're required, allowing relatively ineffective methods as options, and allowing exclusions for certain classes of fishing vessels. 80% of the measures lack performance standards, so there's no explicit way to evaluate how effective the measures are. As discussed earlier, measures are piecemeal. They're developed without considering potential conflicts across vulnerable groups, and RFMOs largely don't account for or manage collateral or indirect effects of fishing operations. RFMOs employ 60% of surveillance methods that are required to assess compliance. A lack of transparency and limited reporting of inspection effort, identified infractions and enforcement actions, and outcomes further limits the ability to assess what level of compliance is occurring. RFMO participation in cross-sectoral marine spatial planning is limited. 3 of the 13 RFMOs that were included in the study have mandates that are broader than managing fisheries. That includes CAMLAR and the 2 RFMOs for anadromous species. RFMOs can gradually transition to an ecosystem approach to fisheries management from the status quo of single species stock assessments and biological reference points for a small proportion of market species, mixed progress in controlling fishing mortality of vulnerable species, and identification and closure to demersal fishing in vulnerable benthic marine sites, to estimating and accounting for indirect effects of fishing, including cryptic losses, using multi-species ecosystem level models, indicators, and thresholds, participating in marine spatial planning, which is planning for multi-objective ecosystem-based management of all sectors that affect an explicit site, not just the fishing sector, and balancing anthropogenic mortality across and within trophic levels within their natural production capacities. This is a screenshot of a page where you would publish a record of a fishery-dependent data set. It's part of the Sustainable Fisheries Partnerships FisheriesWiki.org website. Cataloging metadata of fishery-dependent data sets is needed to enable discovery of relevant data sets so that the researchers can then access and pool them so they can support large temporal and spatial scale analyses. It's critically important, in particular, for rigorous pelagic ecosystem modeling for regional fisheries for highly migratory fish stocks. So I encourage you to have a look at that website and see how that may be used. In a recent study, we developed a standard against which to assess the transparency of information to determine compliance with RFMO obligations. And we applied it to one RFMO, the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, which is one of the 5 tuna RFMOs. There was a transparency for 45% of the elements included in the suite of criteria. We included 12 criteria in this suite, which is shown in the slide. It ranged from information on compliance with required regional observer coverage rates to information on whether the RFMO Secretariat employed powers to address non-compliance by its members and cooperating non-members. So in conclusion, priorities for RFMOs to gradually transition to ecosystem-based fisheries management of high seas fisheries is to address deficits in basic elements of management systems, including monitoring, risk assessment, control, surveillance, enforcement, as well as transparency and information on compliance. Some of the RFMOs have extremely rudimentary systems, but even these can gradually adopt elements of an ecosystem approach. There's a need to move to multi-species ecosystem level models, indicators, and thresholds, to make research-grade data open access, enable discovery by cataloging rich metadata, to estimate and account for indirect effects of fishing operations, including cryptic removals, and to participate in marine spatial planning, which is a framework for cross-sectoral ecosystem-based management. Thank you.
I have a question, Eric. It's been a number of years that we put cameras on my icebreakers to monitor the ice. And they send back pictures, I don't know, every minute or half minute or something like that. And it's my understanding that there is discussion of actually putting those sorts of cameras, which are very cheap now, on the back of some of these fishing boats and having that as a mandated way of keeping track of what they're doing and for monitoring. And I wondered if you could comment on where things are with that.
Thank you. There's a number of trials of electronic monitoring occurring in longline and purseine tuna fisheries. I believe Australia is one of the first, their tuna longline fishery is one of the first to adopt required monitoring through use of digital cameras. ISSF, NGO, that's a combination of WWF and tuna canneries, is sponsoring trials of electronic monitoring in a number of purseine and longline tuna fisheries now, starting this year and probably into next year. So it's looking promising. Some of the management authorities for the small island developing states have been eager to participate in the trials, others less so. I think their concern is that they're struggling with traditional human observers, and they're hesitant to adopt a new technology that requires substantial capacity building of their in-country staff to monitor and maintain the equipment, but also monitor the video footage after it's collected.
Jeff Ardron, IASS. Yeah, Eric, I actually read that paper, and it's very good. Thank you. I grabbed a few statistics and put them on slides about the observers. But my question to you is about actually the compliance reporting. We just had a quick look at this in my institute, and we couldn't even tell because of the lack of compliance reporting within most RFMOs if they were even doing compliance, and if there were infractions, and if there were, what happened afterwards. And I just wondered if you could comment on that, because you looked into this in more detail. How much is actively being done by RFMOs and just not being reported versus just not being done?
I'm most familiar with the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, and perhaps others like Martin could talk about some of the other RFMOs. But for this one RFMO, the members and cooperating non-members are required to submit 2 reports. One is publicly available, the other one is confidential. The confidential reports often lack a lot of detail, so even they don't provide a good basis for determining compliance, and they're self-reporting. So there's no independent assessment for compliance. So I think the level of reporting varies RFMO by RFMO, and the requirements also vary quite a lot. Yeah. But overall, I would expect that most of the RFMOs would achieve very low scores when assessed against this standard for the public availability of information to determine whether the member states are complying with their obligations.
Hi, I'm Catherine Kilduff with the Center for Biological Diversity, and I've read that fisheries might be more ecosystem-based if we actually fished less selectively and took a whole ecosystem and then actually utilized it. And so I was wondering if you had any ideas, especially with FADs, how you could do that, or whether it's even possible, or our current governance structure just won't let us to go the other way towards less selective fishing.
Martin was a co-author of a recent publication that was led by Serge Garcia about balanced harvesting. Pelagic fisheries are probably one of the worst examples of how to apply this concept, because there aren't markets for a large proportion of species across trophic levels in pelagic ecosystems. In order to make the concept work, you would have to have markets for species within each trophic level and for age classes across individual populations. So maybe the concept would be best applied to coastal fisheries in Southeast Asia, where almost all the catch is retained and used for human consumption. Pelagic fisheries tend to focus on selected species with an upper trophic level, and there's very little utilization of lower trophic level species. So I'd say in concept, at least currently, given current market demands, it's not likely implementable for pelagic fisheries.
But, sorry, one more question. Because of the gear, so I'm a little bit interested in how you would implement that, because it seems like from a human perspective, it's easier to control the markets than it is the biology of the species, which we don't know that much about. So just the fact that there aren't markets, it seems like there are ways that we could create a market. And is it, so I'm interested in whether it's the gear. Like if you had a hold and you were required to keep everything you caught, sort of like the movement fish fight in Europe, wouldn't that sort of drive the markets because you have something that you can't get rid of unless you sell it?
The main methods for pelagic fishing are pursine, long line, pole and line, other gears, troll, hand line, gill net. Those methods are very selective. They don't catch lower trophic level pelagic ecosystem species. And so the gears currently being used are not ecosystemic. They're very selective. In order to move towards a more balanced removal of organisms from pelagic ecosystems, you would need to probably first develop markets for those species. You wouldn't have an incentive for fishermen to develop new fishing methods to target those species for which there's no value. So even if the tuna vessels retained everything that they catch, you still wouldn't be a balanced harvest because they're selecting individuals from upper trophic levels primarily, and within the upper trophic level, they're selecting certain age classes and certain species.
Good morning. I'm Martin Hall from the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission. Very happy to be here. I want to thank the organizers, and I'm especially pleased to work with something called the Center for Ocean Solutions, with an accent in the word solutions. Working fisheries management sometimes feels like being in a large hospital where you have a wing with physicians doing diagnostics, and another wing with forensic pathologists, and nothing in between. So I'm especially interested in the conversation with students and young researchers. I'm loud enough to, yeah. Thank you. And the idea is for the researchers and young students that are present here to perceive this, realize that those two wings are already overpopulated, and that you have space, be effective and not strident, and produce more change than papers. Nothing wrong with the papers, but the objective should be the other one. And what I'm going to say is something, I had to produce this after signing a waiver yesterday that what I'm saying may appear in the internet. I feel like those teenagers that send a compromising photograph to somebody and appears in Facebook someday. So normally when I'm in a university setting, I'm very free and can speak frankly and openly because there are no political implications and so on. But if it is recorded, it may be used against you, as you say in the. So, but I will. I just trimmed a little bit, and let's get going with this. Okay. I forgot the punch message. you already saw these maps. The commissions are something that was created beginning in about the 40s. So they predate, they don't predate the ecosystem, but they predate our idea to introduce the ecosystem there. So we started with something very, very focused. You have commissions to handle Pacific Hollywood, which are 2 countries, just neighbors. You have Salmon Commission, again, very few countries, and then you have other very, very different commissions. So when you're talking about regional organization, there's a whole variety of them, and the way to work in them is different. And in the past, I have been with the commissions for about 28 years now, and we have had some successes, and I'm just going to mention one. And things have been changing, and I want to show you a bit of the history. And I'm building on the excellent presentation from Elizabeth and Eric, who spoke about tuna very specifically, and they really open up a lot of the issues that I need to mention. So this is dolphin mortality from 86 to now. The mortality from 130,000 to about 900, and the low levels have been maintained for 20 years now. So when you discuss the success of programs, I suggest a 20-year scale. This applies to catch shares and some other things that have just started. So you need to look at the long term. So this has worked for 20 years. Many countries cooperating to do this. One of the major dolphin stocks involved in the fishery, showing increasing signals of positive recovery. The Bayesian model suggests that the rates are positive with about 99% for this species, about 96 for the other one. So they are beginning to recover. That's the main point. And this was done with a lot of cooperation between countries. This is a list of the countries in ITTC. You're not going to be able to read them. But I want to say here is, when you look at these complexes of countries, what do you have here? Well, you have island countries like Vanuatu and Kiribati. You have Japan, you have the European Union, you have Nicaragua and the US. So cultural differences, huge economic development differences, political differences. You have leftist and rightist regimes in the same continent participating here. So the priority for artisanal fishing, for instance, may vary between country and country according to who is in power. So all these things are mixing here. So it's not difficult to see that. It's very difficult to put a blender that come up with something really tasty out of this. But we've been trying to do that for many years, and I guess we'll keep trying. You have fisheries and ports in the whole continent. You have a bunch of countries practicing purseeining. Some of the flags are to the upper left. And then longliners, which are different countries in the lower part. And for many years, the pole and line fisheries were small scale, small thing, not big issue. These were the large industrial fisheries in the area. The purseeiners taking mostly yellowfin tuna on dolphins. That was the main target initially. Then they expanded to the others. And the longline fishery mainly focused in the Big Eye. So Big Eye to Asian markets, sashimi, high value product, low production, yellowfin, large production, canning, US and other locations initially. So for many years, we worked with this parallel system of harvest, if you want. So the purseine fleet operated from some markets and the other for other ones. So these two fleets, I would argue that they were reasonably compatible. The longliners fished some yellowfin, so there was some interception, but the main money maker was Big Eye. So this is the good period, the period where people could do their own thing, improve your own fishery, and you don't have to deal with the others. When the dolphin issue appeared, we started with a cultural issue. Some of the countries have different views of dolphins than other countries. And it's not right or wrong, there are cultural differences. So for instance, some countries didn't want to go to reduce dolphin mortality to levels below sustainability on principles. So for them, there were resources to be harvested sustainably. For other people, dolphins were different. So you have to live with that. So that was part of what was inside the Commission. You have countries with this very different view. The way to bypass issue, and one of the solutions that were produced, was a separate agreement. So within the ITTC, they created something called the Agreement for the Dolphin Conservation Program. So the countries that were willing to do that moved to the side, and they set very low dolphin mortality limits and so on, following what those countries wanted. The countries that did not agree with that sort of value system did not join, but they did not block that. So the agreement was administered by ITTC, and it has a lot of review procedures. There is a review panel that looks at all the infractions and so on. So it's a very sophisticated agreement. But there was a bypass. So we eliminated the cultural gap by pushing an agreement to the side. More recently, the fishery on fats developed in part through dolphin safe issues that were mentioned before. And this fishery catches juveniles of the dolphin fishery and juveniles of the longline fishery, besides as high bycatches of many species, which really don't make happy the artisanal fishermen in the coastal zones. So suddenly we have this thing here. So from the very organized drawings that you saw, this is the picture that you see on the ring. In big campaigns against fat fishing from the point of view of Greenpeace and other countries, and the supermarket structure that Elizabeth described so well is a very vulnerable link in the chain, because a supermarket doesn't want to lose customers. So if a customer spends $2 in tuna and $300 in other products, you don't want the consumer annoyed because you don't have the right tuna and cross the street and go to Tesco or Safeway instead of your supermarket. So they are especially vulnerable, and Greenpeace had a moment of talent. They found out where the button was and they pressed it. It was a very clever thing, and it worked for that purpose. So there are a lot of markets closing to fat fishing, which is the largest way of producing tuna. The alternative way proposed, which is pole and line, will never produce the volume of tuna that you can put in a can for less than $10 or $15. There is nothing wrong with pole and line fishing, but it simply will not provide the volume of catches. So there is a big campaign there. Greenpeace has also some issue with dolphin fishing, but it has really taken a much lower level of intensity than the fat campaign. There are issues of bycatching with longline fleets. Artisanal longliners, as I mentioned, are not happy with. So this is the perspective now. And I go back to the competition that Elizabeth mentioned. Suddenly, I can compete with you by using problems with your way of producing fish. So if I'm producing tuna on dolphins, and you're producing on fats, and you're in trouble with Greenpeace, then I'm benefiting from that fact. The market that close to you stay open to me, or my product goes up. So I would say that there is sort of a perverse incentive that says status quo, no solutions, conflict is good for some. So instead of having an incentive to work together, the cooperation that was mentioned before, we have something that is the cruel economics, that if I can keep you from getting to the market, my fish is worth more money. So, and that's the crude reality that plays in there. So, and this is the issue. So the environmental issues are one more tool in competition between companies, and that's what is happening. RFMOs, like the Commission, operate by consensus. So you can imagine how easy it is to block something that may solve a problem and that you don't want solved. You can even add a couple of things. You work to make it unacceptable to the others, and eventually it will be blocked. So a lot easier to block than to produce things. So perhaps they need to start moving out and creating these separate, smaller agreements. And then a couple of issues for lawyers and those interested in conventions and so on. When they write these conventions, they are written in very general terms, and I'm going to address a couple of specific things. So we are supposed to manage vessel fishing for tuna. What is a vessel fishing for tuna? Well, stupid question. Per seiner is built to catch tuna, the wells are for tuna. Okay, the coastal longliners, which are maybe 10,000, 15,000, catch tuna, billfish, sharks, and a couple of other things in different proportions. How many of those boats are fishing for tuna? Well, again, arbitrary issue. Somebody put it there, and then somebody has to interpret how much tuna fishing means you're a tuna fishing boat. So this has to do even with IUU and those things. Are you including the tuna fishing vessels list or not? So this is something ill-defined. And then the even more complex ones, we're supposed to deal with associated or dependent species. Given the tunas that we deal with, it's very hard to find anything in the ocean from a copepod to a seabird that is not connected to a tuna. So do we start with recovery program for copepod? Phytoplankton were a problem that was mentioned here before. So there are two options. The one they call the Genghis Khan school, which is the more we can have in the commission, the more we want to have. And this is just a decision. The other is, where is a sensible limit given the economic resource and the people we have? And there's no clear answer for that. So, but we are thrown a lot of issues, and they are complicated issues, and the reason for that are things such as this. For instance, mahi-mahi, the bycatch in the percent fishery may be 2% of the total catch. Are we going to manage the mahi-mahi for the whole continent from the tuna commission? The bycatch of hammerhead sharks is less than 1% of the total harvest. Most of the harvest is coastal in the 200-mile zones, juvenile catch, and so on. So this to me is, and the image I have is trying to shake an elephant from the tail. It's not the right way to move it. So these fishes cannot be managed, in my opinion, this is a very personal opinion, from where we are. So we can help the countries by building human resources and capacity to do such assessment. But if we want to do all these things, we're going to do even worse. And I will leave the words there without qualifications. So these are the major fisheries in a geographical setting, because I want to enter into a geographic issue. The dolphin set most in the north. The area you have there is about 4,000 or 5,000 miles longitudinally. And this is a very dramatic map, but it shows the bathymetry of the Eastern Pacific Ocean, which is very different from others. So we have places where the coast is about 5 miles from 3,000 meters depth. So the high seas are in your garden. You can have a guy with a rowboat fishing beside a 70-meter-long tuna boat. So the interaction between artisanal fisheries and industrial fisheries are horrendous here. And the management of these things, when you include the EECs and the sovereignty issues, becomes really complicated. It's just two. Other areas, there is a nice separation. The Patagonia, the shelf is huge, so you have an ecosystem which is associated to a transition. Here, there is no transition. So this brings the artisanal fisheries in collision with industrial fisheries, and that's where even the political systems are important. So what do we do with all these fisheries and all these resources? Some of them are highly migratory, some are mobile. There are coastal sharks, there are many other things, snappers and groupers, extremely important for the coastal economies. So should there be coastal commissions associating several countries, sub-regional bodies taking all these responsibilities? We don't know. One of the solutions I believe in is a lot of the impacts in the Eastern Pacific on conservation issues are coming from artisanal fisheries, fishing in the coastal zone with long line, gill nets, and so on. It's one of the cases where you have conservation and poverty in the same place. Conservation is not going to win in that, so you need to work with those to improve the conditions, move the fisheries towards sustainability, help move the communities away from poverty if you really want to do conservation. There are fisheries in Central America that fish for about 3 months of the year, newly born hammerhead sharks about this size. They are for local consumption. There is no eco-labeling, there is no CITES, there is no finning. This just goes to ceviche. And if that's the only resource there, it's going to be harvested. So what do you do with those? So I think the commissions and other international bodies should address all this big array of artisanal coastal fishery with a huge impact on the ecosystems. So this has been a shooting of a bunch of subjects, and then I want to take your questions, and then a couple of issues that I wanted to bring for the discussion, including an answer to a previous question there. But I will take your questions here and then go back to some of these subjects. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Talk, so let's go ahead and let them.
Yes, hi, good morning. My name is Terry Shore. I'm with Turtle Island Restoration Network. We're a marine conservation group based in Northern California. And our flagship species is the sea turtle, and we do have 2 endangered sea turtle species which come into our coastline here from across the Pacific Ocean. And bycatch and fisheries remains the #1 threat to their continued existence. So I have a question for the panel, and particularly Eric and Martine, but I'm also interested in your comments as well. About what we're hearing a lot about lately on the West Coast is the so-called market transfer effect. And you may be familiar with it, but just a little background. We're speaking particularly on swordfish fisheries, longline and drift gillnet fisheries. We've got the Hawaii longline fishery, and we also have the California drift gillnet fishery, which is of interest to this particular body. And both of these fisheries are relatively high bycatch and do continue to take marine mammals and turtles. However, there have been improvements in these fisheries, and these fisheries certainly have higher standards for under U.S. regulations than other fisheries. So the market transfer effect that is being forwarded is this argument that if we increase our production of U.S. swordfish under our regulations, even if it increases the take of marine mammals or endangered sea turtles, that ultimately it's a benefit to the endangered species and to U.S. seafood consumers, because it will somehow offset the amount of swordfish or tuna that's caught or sold by international fleets. So obviously we have our views on that, but I'd really like to hear from the experts, Eric, Martin, and you. Thank you.
How's this thing work? Push the button. Yeah. Is it on? And thanks for your question. We talked a little bit about it last night during dinner. There was some research when the Hawaii longline shallow set swordfish fishery was closed for about 2 years over concerns of sea turtle interactions that international fisheries then filled that void to supply swordfish to the U.S. market. And I think it's pretty valid. A lot of Taiwanese vessels will include shallow hooks on buoy lines to target billfish and sharks. And so those fisheries are not nearly as well managed as the U.S. fishery. So if you were to close the U.S. swordfish fishery and increase fishing effort by those foreign fleets, you would definitely result in higher levels of bycatch mortality. However, I've never seen any empirical evidence that those foreign fleets increase their effort. It may just been a matter of changing the destination of markets for their products. I think there's a lot of benefit for having rigorous management of the U.S. fleet, because the measures that the U.S. fisheries are subject to then feed into the RFMO level. So binding measures can be adopted that are applicable to international fisheries. And there's been some movement in that direction. However, a lack of information to ensure compliance by those foreign fisheries is still a huge deficit. So even though there's been some improvement in the adoption of binding measures by RFMOs, it's likely very low compliance. I guess the short answer is no, I wouldn't relax measures on the U.S. fishery because of concerns of displaced effort.
And just a small addition, somebody's going to catch the resources. So it's your choice to have something that you have some control of, or somebody else that you may lose the control. There are other markets. And in the case of tuna dolphin, Mexico is exporting all the fish to the US. Now it's all consumed in Mexico. So Mexico stays in the agreement because they want to. Right now they don't have a market incentive. Well, they have these WTO issues and so on. But if you control or somebody else fishes, and maybe you lose control. So it's a choice.
I agree with those dynamics and have seen some of that with tuna fisheries, but I think it's really worth considering very carefully the nature of the fishery. Is it a fishery that there's multiple fleets that are coming in that are under different flag arrangements? So looking at the specificity of that fishery, I think can really help to make that kind of calculation of what will happen with effort if regulations change. But I think the relationship between flags and fishing firms is a really important one to keep in mind.
And I'll just add that this is a sort of fundamental problem with most of these labeling. Well, you're not talking about labeling, but essentially if we have the turtle safe label in the United States, that can actually transfer product to other countries. And so we actually see that happening, as Martine just said. So what you really need is, again, this global shift. Otherwise, there will always be someplace else for them to sell it.
Hi, my name is Ben Pittinger. I'm not affiliated with any organization. I'm an independent environmental attorney and high school teacher. I want to draw in an idea and see where you might see it fit within each of your areas. And it's an analogy to energy regulation, where there's been a drive over the last decade or more to decouple volume from profits. Now, there's some real strong comparisons. It's entrenched industry. They say, we know how to run it. We'll run it the most or the best. Volume is hooked to profits. And as a result, there's a disincentive towards demand-side management. There's obvious weaknesses in the analogy also in that there's natural monopolies and regulatory controls of rates. But this is my question. Where within regulation do you see us possible for us to look at how to decouple volume and profits and thereby incentivize the industry to work on demand-side management and somehow bring that side of things under control so that they're working on efficiency both in their processors and anywhere down the market line?
I think Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think there are so many different approaches to fisheries management, and this is a big question going back to a lot of yesterday's discussions about quotas and quota systems and what kinds of incentives those put forward. So in some ways, that's an effort to do that decoupling, to say there's this cap, and then now industry, it's up to you to figure out how you're going to make that as economically efficient as possible for you. And so, but then of course there are lots of complications in terms of short-term and long-term incentives that go along with those. So, and furthermore, that creation of quotas isn't always the best match for specific fisheries. So we're still seeing a lot of management based on overall effort, capacity controls, for example. So, so I think that there are opportunities to see that decoupling, and then it's interesting to look inside what individual fishers are doing to try to create profit with a given volume that they're working with. So one of the things that we're starting to see now in tuna fisheries is that purse seiners are starting to add new super freezing technologies and to try to treat some of the catch that was going into canned sector, very low value product, and trying to divert it into a lower quality, not sashimi grade tuna, but something that's steaks or can be processed in a different way. So there still is a lot of room for technological innovation, and we're seeing a lot of really ingenious kinds of solutions and efforts to make that happen.
Is there room for demand side, or are we set on a never-ending growth of the market, which will be the demise?
I think that in many countries there is a possibility of increasing the consumption of higher quality tuna than the can. I think that is a possibility, and Elizabeth mentioned one of the ways. There are some of the boats fishing on fats that are utilizing everything else, well caught, well preserved, high value product. I think that the US consumer that wants to do a healthy barbecue, you're talking about a skipjack like this that goes to a can. That's a great fish for a grill too. It doesn't make it because of the way it is produced. It's not out of the question that we can increase a lot the proportion. And an example in other fisheries is the anchoveta from Peru that was used in a criminal way to fish chicken in Germany, for instance. A much higher proportion of the anchoveta is being used and packed for human consumption in Peru, which has a protein deficit, serious protein deficit. And that's increasing the value of the anchoveta. There are smaller boats that make smaller catches and they make good money with human consumption. That's a way to really increase the average value of the ton. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Willow Batista. I work for the Center for Ocean Solutions in addition to EDF. My question, I think, is related to that. I've learned a bit about, in the past, the United States government taking steps to actually directly impact and change consumer choices to the point that they were even sending, in like the 50s, sending recipes in the mail to people for fish that they were hoping to encourage demand for. I'm wondering if there's anything like that going on now in this or any other country, and do you think it's a good idea? I saw you shaking your head, so.
The information on what is good to eat has been so dominated by the industry that I don't believe a word of it. Mm-hmm. You know, milk is fantastic, meat is fantastic, and you cannot live without this, you cannot live without that. Garbage, complete garbage. So, and you have 100 or 150 years of that advertisement is coming from your grandparents already. So I think that the government should not tell people what to eat. People should figure out, and according to their principles and their characteristics. But the government intervention in this has been always bad.
One example I can provide from tuna fisheries is in the United Kingdom, there is very little market demand for albacore tuna, but there is quite a bit of growing demand for fresh frozen albacore in the United States. The stocks of albacore are a lot better condition than big eye and yellowfin. The UK market is primarily interested in yellowfin. So we've been working with some of the suppliers to UK retailers to try and introduce albacore. The retailers have adopted sustainable sourcing policies for seafood, so they require that fisheries are either MSC certified or in an improvement project to lead towards an unconditional pass against MSC. Fisheries for albacore, pole and line, long line can achieve that, but most fisheries that catch big eye and yellowfin can't. So we'll see how it turns out, but I think that's a useful change in market demand because it's a more sustainable product.
I think it's really difficult to decouple government information programs from sort of industry and advocacy debates that are happening in the field. And I think that's historically, we can see that if we go back to tuna dolphin, it's the Dolphin Consumer Protection Act that's done by the government but enforced by Earth Island Institute. I think some of the ways that we're seeing these debates play out now are around food safety issues in fisheries in particular. So questions around mercury levels, what are the safe levels for consumption for mercury? And we're seeing debates between government agencies about those recommendations, and then behind the scenes, huge fights between environmental advocacy groups and industry groups. So I think it's very difficult to decouple government regulations from the environmental and industrial lobbies that are informing them and pushing for various kinds of regulations. But definitely government is still involved, and this is one of the big problems with fisheries is it's overall really healthy product, and we want to encourage people to eat that, so it makes it challenging.
Yeah, and I would sound a note of caution. I know I said demand-side mechanisms are necessary, but we also need to recognize that these mechanisms will be regressive. And so if you're really thinking about the larger picture, then something that you want to think about is, well, what other protein sources are available? So if we can target high-priced species for one thing. I don't know if government is the right person to do that, but I certainly think that the many NGOs that are passionate about this are doing the right thing there. And also those are the people who are most likely to change their behavior. But when we're talking about canned tuna, we're talking about stuff that is largely consumed by people who are relatively poor. And so when you're talking about that, you need to give them a viable option so that they don't go hungry, basically.
Yeah, it's amazing. My question relates to quite a bit of what has been discussed. And Elizabeth, you triggered this. When you said the supermarkets are struggling to provide fish to us at very small margins, right? And I've been thinking about this because I think this stems from the fact that we all love cheap things. We all love to buy things cheaply. This is from economics, and I'm one of you. Right? I like to cheap things. But I think this is an issue we need to think deeply about how to deal with that. I just came back from England, and there was this big uproar about horse meat being sold as beef. You all heard about that, right? They're really selling 5% of the meat they claim to be beef is horse meat. So we're talking about this at lunch, and everybody's giving reasons why. It's ethics, people are immoral. And as an economist, I was thinking of this, and I said, I think the reason is that we love cheap things, right? So the supermarkets are struggling to supply us beef cheaply, as cheap as possible. And there's a limit to which you can go. So if you are really going to continue doing that, you end up eating horse meat, and maybe even bugs in the future. So I think at some point we have to decide there are certain things we just can't get them cheaply and decide to do this. And I don't think we don't know how to do that, because our children, right? The way you treat your kids, your daughters and sons, it's not about cheapness, right? Most of us. So how can we translate some of this into important issues like that? And you triggered that.
Well, I think one of the big complications here in thinking about canned tuna as a product, and Martine was making this point, is that historically canned tuna was something that grocery stores used as a loss leader. So what that meant was they would put it heavily on sale because that would attract mom, only moms do the shopping apparently, to come in on the weekend and do the big sort of basket shopping. So to this day, all of the Nielsen data on supermarket purchasing shows that if a basket at checkout, if it has cans of tuna in it, is worth over $80 on average, a basket without canned tuna is worth only $20 on average. So this really complicates your point, Rashid, because it's about supermarkets having the logic of selling a bundle of goods. So it means that the price we're paying for tuna is completely delinked to the price that it takes to produce it, to the values that we associate with conservation. And so this really creates a major complication in how we think about management as a whole, and when we say we're willing to pay more for tuna that was caught sustainably, that's not actually what we're paying for. It's about this whole bundle of goods that a massive supermarket is selling to us.
So this is going to be, oh, sorry, Martin.
No, you have Barry at some point that I don't know, he gave up and sat, and then here, this guy. Okay.
So this will be our last question, and then I'm going to ask our panelists to briefly wrap up.
Yeah, so Katie Cito, UC Berkeley. I would welcome an answer from everyone, but the question that I have emerged from Martine and Elizabeth's talks, and it stems around the disparity that both of you briefly touched on between sort of developing countries and developed countries around, Elizabeth, you were talking about processing revenue and sort of where the geography of where processing plants are and where who gets that revenue and who gets the revenue from canning and from shipping and things like that. And then you, Martine, actually talked about the actual competition between small-scale and large-scale fishers for the fish itself. And I wondered if both of you could just develop that a little bit more, like possible hopeful points. You know, I know that we're talking about U.S. nutritional needs and things like that, but of course the most fish protein dependent people and revenue deficient are in developing countries. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
You go first.
Thank you. It's a great question for a pretty long haul. The impact of the industry in countries like Ecuador is impossible to estimate unless you really see it. The employment ashore is immense. Some silly details, if a woman gets pregnant and she's single, the canneries have nurseries. Other companies don't. See the way it affects women labor there. So it's exploitation, but at the same time, it's providing a job to somebody who couldn't have it. So it leaves to you the dilemma of what is right and what is wrong. But they have a major role in the whole community. In the canning industry, you have all the jobs around there. In the artisanal communities, you have many jobs in the community itself. The hooks are sold locally, somebody fixes engines, and so you have a spread, low-level jobs scattered along the continent. And a conversion that would be nice to me is that the product from artisanal fishery that can be processed to higher levels, that those things develop within the communities. So, for instance, I was talking to artisanal fishermen operating close to Lima in Peru about the possibility of opening coastal restaurants where their wives or their families could process the fish caught that day and sell it to tourists for a profit. The intermediaries, and this should be erased from the tape, the intermediaries probably multiply the price of fish from the beach to the supermarket here by a factor of 7 or something like that. So there's one guy who risks the life and works very hard, 5 in the middle that put money in the bank and somebody who buys it here. Mm-hmm. So that's the way things work. So there is a lot of money in the way. And that's something that could change the value for the fishermen. If there were more direct ways for the fishermen to commercialize. And I've discussed this with regard to some fisheries where we wanted to reduce effort, produce outlets in the US or in the UK for products coming from some fishery. Say you want a grouper fishery to stop fishing 3 months because you have a turtle nesting season in that period there. Well, increase the value of the fish before and after, go fish outside, and look for a market here that says we want that grouper that allows the turtles to go by. So we haven't done that. It needs to be done, and I think NGOs could have a major role in finding these alternative activities for fishing groups.
The dynamics in the Pacific are quite different to what Martine has described in Ecuador. The processing plant conditions are dramatically worse in the Pacific than they are in Ecuador. And Ecuador's workforce in the industry is one of their real pride and joys. They're really, really proud, and they say that's what makes the difference in their ability to compete in this global market. In the Pacific Island countries have these extremely rich resources, but because of their remoteness, distance to markets, many do not have, there's no duty-free access into the US market, for example, so operating costs are very high. And so what's happening in the Pacific is that those countries that have enough infrastructure to do processing are now exerting their sovereignty over the resources to try to tie licensing conditions to processing plant investments. So Papua New Guinea has had the most success in this arena, and they offer secure long-range licenses, which today is becoming a very important incentive in exchange for building processing plants. But the way that the dynamics unfold around that is quite interesting, because firms then, the processing plant becomes a cost of the licensing fee. It's not necessarily to make money off of the processing activities. So we're seeing a lot of difficulties in labor conditions, a lot of efforts to divert product around. So one example is that there's one processing firm that gave licenses to 16 vessels to access to 8 Pacific Island countries. There's one tiny processing plant, and the joint venture in that partner is one of these 3 trading companies that I mentioned. So they get the balance of all of the fish that's caught. They get the ability to trade that to Thailand where it's processed. And then they just have to pay for the small processing plant that creates 500, 600 jobs in the Pacific. So very different dynamics, and there isn't the same sort of intersection in the Pacific between industrial and artisanal fisheries, although these processing plants are creating more tensions out of that relationship.
I'll just add one more twist to it, which is that I work for a Chinese company that owns and operates longline tuna vessels in the Pacific Islands. And through some of their foreign license access agreements, some of the countries are keen to eventually replace that foreign-owned vessels with domestically owned vessels. But the nationals of that country wouldn't be the people on the fishing boat. They would still be imported labor, so that they may be the owners of the vessel and benefiting more economically from their operation. But it still would be crew from the Philippines, Bangladesh, lots of different places that are willing to work in pretty harsh conditions at low wages. So it's, again, a different situation than in the Eastern Pacific, where you have artisanal fisheries that are benefiting directly from the resource.
So we are out of time for questions. I'm sorry.
I just want to say one thing. Sure. I'm from Hawaii, and I live in Seattle. I love the information you have. It's very useful. And the orientation seems to be about problems. So what I want to add, and this is to everybody, there's a Honolulu-based global ocean organization, and it works with corporations, only with corporations. So I want people to know that, because this is the topic. It's called the World Ocean Council, and it's run by a former United Nations person. So I want people to know that, because he's focused on working with corporations, and corporations run most everything. So I think it's very important for people here to be attending those kinds of his conferences, or those kinds of conferences, because those people need to have this information and input. So thank you.
Okay, so before everyone heads out, I would like each of our panelists to offer a final takeaway from just, I did prep this, you have to read your emails. Just one big takeaway thought from our discussion today. I think it's been really fascinating and very wide-ranging. We've gone from tuna industry, canning, to small-scale fisheries. So I'd love just a really quick brief from each one of you. Not required if you don't want one, but.
I say Martine starts and then maybe.
Surprise, surprise. She wants a brief start.
Yeah.
I want to say something that doesn't belong to what happened, but it addressed a question before. And one of my big questions about ecosystem-based management is, we did not start harvesting the ecosystem thinking of the ecosystem. We went after the dollars dressed as tunas or cod or something. So now we're coming after the fact to figure out how it should be done. Many years ago, I started saying that somehow this way of harvesting, which is selective for species and selective for sizes, did look to me like the worst possible way to maintain a structure which is functioning as a network. It was just intuition. But luckily, I convinced a few people, and very recently, a study was published, first a report from IUCN, that Christina is probably aware of, by Serge Garcia and others, and then a science forum on that. The idea is balanced harvesting, which is distributing effort and impacts among more species across and along the ecosystem, is a lot more is a better, a more benign way to harvest if you want to maintain the integrity of the ecosystem and the productivity of the ecosystem. They ran about models in 30 different ecosystems. Some of the best modelers that I know, Beth Fulton, that Alistair knows, and Marie-Jo Rochette, and Alida Bundi, and others. They are excellent researchers with different methods, and they all show the same thing. The number of species driven to very low numbers is minimal when we harvest in proportion to the production of the different groups. So the question is, how do you do it with the tuna fisheries? You reduce the harvest of what is being harvested to the max now, and you redistribute catches among other species which are underexploited. And instead of having the ecologists twisting the world to fix demand and supply, get the marketing guys and the economists twist the world to fix the ecological laws.
I have a two-part closing statement. One is that there's a lot of very rudimentary management systems for fisheries, both domestic and regional, and many of them are hesitant to try to take up any new methods for managing fisheries. So I think there's a bit of an opportunity there to explain how elements of ecosystem-based fisheries management don't require anything drastically different from what they've been doing. And the second point is that there's a need not to rely on these traditional management structures for improving fisheries, but we should rely also on market-based influences, such as are developing quite well in North America, Europe, and Australia, and try to spread that to other regions.
Industry structure matters for how fisheries management happens and how we use resources.
Wow.
Nice. All right, I'm going to be shorter. Save the fish, save the world. Thank you.